Yippee! Nothing like technology to make us all crazy. Hi, everybody.
Oh, hello, Lynn.
Hi. I'm so sorry about that. I didn't actually. Anyway, you know how it goes. There we are. We're all here. We're all together. It's awesome.
Okay, I'll introduce everyone. Welcome everyone now, since we're all here already. Sorry about that, everyone. So I'm going to start. Welcome. I'm Nina Backrack. I am the CEO of Bergen Volunteers. I'm going to be your moderator tonight. So tonight the event is hosted by the Englewood Public Library and also the Coalition for Racial Unity and Equity. For those of you who don't know what the Coalition for Racial Unity and Equity is, we created it to bring racial unity and equity to our county through various education initiatives and activities. Essentially, it's a coalition of organizations that have come together to support each other and our community in efforts to work together for the betterment of all. We do have a Facebook group. It's called CRUE NJ. You can visit us there. And I'll mention also that tonight the workshop is going to be recorded, and then we're going to put it on the Facebook page. So give it a couple of days and you can check back there. You can also watch that Facebook page for our other initiatives. Right now, we're doing a library installation, which is currently in various libraries around the county, including at our host library, Englewood Public Library. This initiative, we are placing signage and a special bookshelf that has authors who are approaching or having approached the topic of race. And then you can see the kind of like that area of focus on that particular bookshelf in those libraries. So tonight we're on a webinar format. If you have any questions, you can put it in the Q&A or in the chat. I'm going to read them out at the end of the presentation. The presentation will be about an hour, and then I'll facilitate a Q&A for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll wrap up hopefully before or by 8:30. Tonight, we're thrilled to host one of our CRUE organizations, Greater Bergen Community Action, with Lynn Allgrant, who's the Vice President of Planning, Development, and Communications. I hope I got that right. So many of you know that Lynn was my predecessor at Bergen Volunteers, and she was the seminar director of our very renowned Bergen Leads program. And I'm an alumna of that program. And when I was in the class, I remember Lynn doing this presentation on redlining in Bergen County, and it was very informative and historical, really fascinating. So you're in for a real treat. And so I'm not going to waste any more time. Without further ado, take it away, Lynn.
Thank you. Thank you, Nina, so much. And thank you, CRUE, for inviting me. And thank you, Englewood Public Library, one of my favorite places on earth. Do I have the ability to share my screen? I probably do. Yeah. And so I have a pretty brief PowerPoint presentation that I'd like to share with you guys. And I'm going to try and make it look like that. Okay. To just talk a little bit about redlining and the history of it and what and its implications today. And I'll tell you that you know, my interest in this, I did study history. I love history, but I love how history informs us going forward. And many of you know that I'm a giant data nerd and census nerd. So so I hope to make this, I know it's a webinar, so it's not quite as interactive as we'd like. But Nina, if there are questions that kind of pop up along the way, I'm happy to sort of pause and take them. Okay, so yep, just absolutely. Jump in anytime. All right. So let's talk about redlining. I want to start out by just giving you a little bit of background about me. I was born on the south side of Chicago in 1963. My birthday is actually on Saturday. So, and this is my block. And as you can see, when I went to the redlining maps of 1940, I happened to be born in what was a yellow district in 1940. By the time I was born, South Calumet was an all-Black community, but mostly single-family homes, all owned by their owners, you know, by the residents. I actually spent my formative years in Melrose, Massachusetts, in this amazing house. It was brown and white when I grew up in it. And it was a blue area. It was a mostly all-white town. We were one of very few Black families in Melrose. I never had another Black child in my class until I moved away. And so Bergen County, as many of you know, and anybody who's spent time with us in Bergen leads, we talk all the time about 70 municipalities, 79 school districts. We're nearly 1 million residents. And we are the definition of borough-itis. In the late 1890s, New Jersey passed a law where a group of residents could form their own town. And a lot of this emerged because of school districts, right? The kind of farming community that was here was bumping up against the New York commuters who moved here. And the New York commuters wanted schools to go beyond the 8th grade. The farming community didn't understand why. And neighbor hashed it out with neighbor, and they formed their own towns. And so Bergen County went from, I think, like 16 or 17 municipalities to 70 within a matter of 5 years. And if some of you have ever wondered why the property lines are or the town lines are sort of weird in your neighborhood, it's because they didn't like somebody, right, who was right next door. And so they went around them and formed their town with other people. And we are literally in the textbooks as the definition of borough-itis. So, and it's important to understand borough-itis and all of these different towns, because as our towns kind of grew and formed their character, which is still with us today, right? A lot of it was around quality schools. A lot of it was around who are our neighbors? Who will our children go to school with? And so borough-itis was the first moment of, yeah, I don't really like that guy so much, so I'm going to skip over his property and I'm going to choose my neighbors near him to be part of my town because we're like-minded. But then there became, over time, a racial and class overlay to those kinds of things. So how did people buy houses back in the day? Before the Great Depression, it was very difficult to buy a house. There were these things called balloon mortgages, where you made small monthly payments for a little while, and then there was a giant payment at the end. They were often just like 5 or 10 years, and you often had to put 30 to 50% down. So buying a home was really, really hard. You had to have a lot of cash, and you had to be ready to do this giant payoff toward the end. And so you can imagine in the Great Depression, people who'd been going along pretty well suddenly couldn't make those payments, or they certainly couldn't make that giant balloon payment. So we had this huge, it wasn't even foreclosures, they just snatched the houses back. You didn't have any equity in it, you didn't have anything, right? And that was a big part of what was going on in the Depression. And so the Great Depression comes along, FDR, the New Deal, we need to create a safety net. And so one of the things as part of the New Deal was the Federal Housing Administration. It's part of Housing and Urban Development now. And it was to improve home financing, improve the quality of housing, right? A lot of houses didn't have indoor plumbing and other kinds of things. And to jumpstart the economy by creating a housing construction industry. And so basically, this is where mortgages, as we know them in the modern era, sort of were created. This idea that you could have 15 or 20 or 30 years to pay off your house. And the only way that banks would jump into this line of business is if these mortgages were federally backed. And so then the question became, well, how is the federal government going to be able to put taxpayers' money at risk in this way? And by the time we get to 1944 and the GI Bill, also to like house veterans, right, with VA loans, sometimes there was only $1 down payment on a house. And so in FDR's New Deal, right, which truly was amazing. I mean, I don't want to minimize how amazing it was, right? as a federal government, we saw senior citizens and their vulnerability, right? And that became Social Security. We saw the differently abled. As we know, FDR, even though he hid it most of the time, was disabled. And so there was Social Security, there were programs for that. There was some seeing of racial minorities. There was some seeing of women, and certainly some seeing of workers, right? And so we're going to make a country in which no one is left out. That's what FDR's motto was in the New Deal. But at the same time, a large portion of the Democratic Party, right? So FDR had the presidency, he had both houses of Congress, but part of his coalition were Southern Democrats. And at the time, Southern Democrats were conservative. They became Republicans, right, between Nixon and Reagan, but they were Democrats at the time. And so for all the groundbreaking and amazing social safety net things that happened in the New Deal, the Southern Democratic Coalition kind of made sure that it didn't actually benefit Black people. So Social Security, when it was first created, it didn't include the majority of professions that were held by Blacks, maids and farm laborers, right? Southern Democrats had a vested interest in not in having Black laborers not be able to retire in comfort. And so they didn't amass Social Security, so they couldn't stop working. And when the Federal Homeowners Association was created and the Homeowners Loan Corporation was built, this system to make sure that the federal government didn't back mortgages that were too risky, they built into the system a system that excluded Black buyers and excluded Black neighborhoods. So here's what the Homeowners Loan Corporation did, and it really was baking racism into the homeowner cake. I mean, there's just no other way to describe this. And I think all historians agree on this, and it just is. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation was charged with determining the risk level of every neighborhood in the United States of America. So they hired realtors from their community to walk around and decide what was the risk level in each neighborhood. And so it favored single family houses over multifamily houses. It favored neighborhoods that were not low income, middle class and upper middle class. Single women were excluded unless they were a war widow, right? So it was impossible to get a mortgage as a single woman, again, unless you were a war widow. And it actually excluded senior citizens and people of color. And so as they walked neighborhoods and they saw who was there, they made determinations on neighborhoods based on who was already living there, on this hierarchy of value, right? Single family versus multifamily, married versus not married, and certainly not a woman, younger as opposed to older, not a person of color, and certainly not low income. Probably the most famous sort of vision of suburbia that we have are the Levitt towns. And he was a private developer. He created these Levitt towns. They were planned cookie cutter homes. And he used both the FHA and the GI Bill to help finance his development. He could build all these houses because he knew that there were all these people who were going to have access to these federally backed mortgages that he could sell them to. And he put into the deeds restrictive covenants. So no Black people were allowed to buy a house in a Levitt town, not even GIs. They could not it was a restrictive covenant in the deed. It could not be sold to a Black person, not on initial building, and not even I'm selling my house to move to someplace that's not Levittown. I couldn't sell it to a Black person. In 1953, the Levittown in New York, it's kind of on its way to Long Island, 70,000 residents in 1953. It was the largest community in the United States with no Black residents because it was a new community, right? Built after World War II. And because of the restrictive covenants, by 1953, a 70,000 person municipality, and it had no Black residents. So what were the criteria to determine a neighborhood's risk? Community assets, racial and ethnic stability, okay? So the homeowners loan corporation made the decision that a racially stable neighborhood, i.e. all white, all Black, all immigrant, was more stable than one that was shifting and had some Black people or some white people, right? So racial and ethnic stability, meaning everybody was all the same and there wasn't much change going on there. Who lived there? What kind of work did they have? What was their immigration status? What was their race? And then some local and environmental conditions. And so this is the 1940 map of Bergen County. We don't have all of it, but I will tell you when I discovered that mapping inequality, and I'll give you the link to this website at the end, that it actually included maps of Bergen County, I was over the moon because very often these kinds of data sets only have urban areas. And so it was kind of cool to be able to see the communities that we know and love and how they were shaped.
Lynn, there's a question, what would fall under the community asset category?
Parks, libraries, good schools, community assets were things like that. Yeah. Any other questions? I'm sorry, I'm talking a little fast because I want to give you time for questions at the end.
I'll interrupt you.
Okay, perfect, good. We'll have a conversation, you and me, Nina. So the 1940 Bergen County assessment, the maps are color-coded. These were ostensibly data-driven analyses, but of course the data was very subjective data, right? Who lives there? What kind of work do they do? So it was kind of a 1940 version of science, right? Homogeneous neighborhoods would be more stable. Again, a neighborhood that's mixed is probably moving in some direction that wouldn't make it the mortgages stable. Certainly Negroes and foreign families, if they were too close or infiltrating. And I want to be clear about this. In addition to being a history major, I was also an English major, right? Language matters, right? So infiltration is a word that was part of the scientific data-driven analysis of neighborhoods, right? So infiltration, infiltrating. And the presence of Jews was very often worrisome in communities. And so at the end of the day, people were the analysts, right? They were walking around, they were looking at neighborhoods, and they were deciding if it was a best neighborhood, a still desirable neighborhood, a definitely declining neighborhood, or a hazardous neighborhood, which was outlined in red. And again, scientific, but it was scientific based on a lot of assumptions, cultural mores, biases, and so I, as a real estate agent walking around, looking at the houses, seeing the people who live there, I'm like, oh, yeah, this is definitely declining, or this is a best neighborhood. So let's dig in to Bergen County. So here's our modern day map, and here's our 1940 map. And, Paramus, until well after World War II, here in the middle, was almost all farm country. So if you ever wonder why Route 4, Route 17, and the Garden State Parkway all go through Paramus, it's because it wasn't developed, right? And so they could buy the land to build the highways. So that's why Paramus is Paramus. And that's why the malls are there too, right? Because, once you have all that. But you begin to see, right, we've got a lot of blue, a little bit of green, lots of yellow, because even in 1940, Bergen County had a large immigrant population. And then we have our tucked in red areas, mostly in the southern part of the county, but we're going to dive into a few of these other places and go like, hey, what was going on over here, right? Who are these folks who are living in Bergen County in these areas? So here's all of Bergen County, the yellow areas, remember, and that's definitely declining, right? And look how widespread that was. And you can see that not all the communities in Bergen County were included in the map. A lot of these areas, Mahwah and some of the other places, were mostly farmland. There weren't enough people there for anybody to bother to go in and decide whether or not you should give a mortgage. But you can see how much yellow, right? This definitely declining thing characterized Bergen County in the minds of the HOLC folks in 1940. And then you can see the pockets that were redlined in Bergen County. Again, mostly in southern Bergen County, Garfield. But then we're going to talk about a couple of these areas that we know well and love.
Before you go on, a couple of
Yes.
questions. So I think they're back on that slide that delineated the color coding. Somebody wanted to see that one again. And then the question was, what determined a hazardous neighborhood? So
Okay. Sorry. Yeah. Where was I? Okay.
This one, yeah.
Right. Redlining. A hazardous neighborhood had a large population of Black folks. Full stop. End of story. And what was a large population of Black folks was in the minds of the beholder, right? So we're going to see some neighborhoods where it's like, oh, there are 10 Black people in this neighborhood, it's hazardous. In another community, it might take 30 or 40. And I'm going to take you through a deeper dive. This definitely declining neighborhoods, quite honestly, it was immigrants or laborers, right? People who worked with their hands. And so I'm going to begin to show you, but when we talk about redlined neighborhoods, right? Redlined neighborhoods were marked hazardous by the HOLC in 1940, and then again in 1945, I think. And mainly, the only thing that distinguished those neighborhoods was the presence of Black people and how many Black people were there. And that is what was red, and that is why we call it redlining. Does that help?
I guess we'll
Any
find
other
out
questions?
when they type their answer.
Yeah, when they type their answer in. All right, so let's do a deeper dive.
Yes, she says thank you.
Okay, sure, no problem. So Ridgewood, beautiful, bucolic, wonderful Ridgewood. So when you click on these maps, you can see the notes that the HOLC reviewers wrote, right? And so Ridgewood had racial covenants on a lot of properties, mostly because and it was against Jews, right? So it's a strongly Christian community, and it's nearly impossible for a Jew to buy residential property within its confines. And so most of Ridgewood was color-coded blue and green because Jews couldn't live there. And this one neighborhood that was yellow was, even though the advantages were that it was located near the schools and the shopping center and just a 10-minute walk from the train station, so you could get to New York City to a big fancy job. But the problem was it was a little too close to an immigrant neighborhood in the next town over. And so it was yellow because it might get infiltrated by the people from the next town over. But overall, Ridgewood was a great place to give a mortgage or buy a piece of property because Jews couldn't buy there. Glen Rock has this really interesting tracks, right? We talk about, oh, the tracks as a dividing line. They often were a dividing line. And the area was affected, so the yellow areas were affected because there was a Black population in Glen Rock in this redlined area. And the areas that were close to them were considered hazardous, not necessarily by the people who lived there, but by the people who lived here. And it was like, wow, it's really close. And if these people get a little bit more money, they might buy a house over here, and then that will turn this neighborhood, right? And so as they walked around, almost all of Glen Rock was blue, right? Still desirable. But a couple of these neighborhoods were a little fragile because they were too close to this neighborhood that had some Black folks. And honestly, not even that many Black folks, but a few. And longstanding Black populations in Bergen County, you know, many of whom, some of our Black families here, right? Their people were enslaved here, and then they were freed and stayed, right? And they've stayed in these communities, and they stayed in these neighborhoods. Westwood is a fascinating story. There was a Black section of town built by a builder named N.T. Hegman, a Negro development concern. I Googled around and I found one of his ads from the Crisis magazine, right, back in the 19-teens, right? And he's like, don't rent here in New York City, you know, come live in beautiful Bergen County in a house that I will build for you. But the neighborhood where he was able to buy land and sell to Black families up and coming and wanting to move out of New York City in the 1920s on into the 1940s, it bordered on the sewage disposal plant in Westwood, right? Back before we had an underground sewer system. All the wells in the area have been condemned for typhoid, right? So here's an environmental injustice issue right here in our beautiful, wonderful Westwood. And so the HOLC people walking around in 1940 were like, this area is less than 20% built up. It has no future, right? And they color-coded it red. All that's left of Mr. Hegman and his desire to help encourage and make money off of, let's be real, Black folks who could put money together and buy a home in beautiful Bergen County and get out of New York City is a little slice of a park called Hegman Park. It is on the edge, it's over here, it's on the edge of the big county park in Westwood that includes the pond and all that great stuff. So we have a town and county park, we have Pascack Valley Hospital, and we have a senior residential facility, all in the neighborhood that in 1940, the HOLC people said there was no future there. Teaneck. Teaneck's yellow area was one of the older areas of Teaneck, and it was not a speculative development. But here's the thing, it had no shifting or infiltration, right? There were not a lot of immigrants, Jews hadn't moved in there were no foreign families, there were no Negroes. So why was it yellow, right? Well, middle-class white-collar workers. And so that was mostly how Teaneck was defined. And so then what was going on with this yellow, right? So the green areas had executives and professionals. They had, shops and schools and all these things, right? But lots of neighborhoods were just completely dismissed. And this one, no future predicted for this neighborhood, right? Even though the Hawthorne Elementary School was there, it got a C. Why? Because Italians, 35% Italians and Poles, and they were laborers and clerks. So if you were executives, right, you were up here, your area was beautiful. And the redlined area, I'm sorry, C45, I'm just trying to read my map here. And then one area was just because of who lived there, right? Because they were immigrants, right? Polish and Italian immigrants, their neighborhood was labeled yellow as definitely declining. And this meant that the property values in those neighborhoods was diminished. And it would be, if you wanted to sell your home, it would be harder for your buyer to be able to get a mortgage, or a mortgage on good terms, right? And so these properties did not appreciate the same way that properties did in other neighborhoods. They just didn't, because they couldn't turn over as easily. And when we look at that neighborhood today in Teaneck, it's quite lovely, right? There are parks, there's open space, there's schools, there are charming residential blocks with big wide sidewalks. But in 1940, because of the people who lived there, right, and the homes haven't changed that much, but because of the people who lived there, it was somewhat written off. And let's look at our beloved Englewood. So the thing that's really interesting is that the neighborhoods that were coded kind of yellow and red in Englewood were close to shopping and churches and parks and schools, right? So they had all the amenities. There were some sewage problems, and quite honestly, we still have some sewage problems, right, around the creek. But the biggest thing that was going on in our Redline neighborhood was that it was 15% Italian. There were already 85 Negroes living there. And most of the work that folks did, they were servants, they were laborers, and they were mill workers. The East Hill, of course, was lovely, fine planning, the best of architecture, right? Sweeping properties, really far away from amenities, right? Shopping, public transportation, all that stuff, no sidewalks. But you know what? It's just not a problem for these folks because they don't need sidewalks, right? They don't need public transportation. Their driver will come and get them and whisk them off to New York City to their very fine executive job. And so it was, right? And so it was. Lovely, large, beautiful, steep slopes, very difficult to get to things, but for this class of people, not an issue. And then the western part of Englewood, we've got some immigrant families, boop, color it yellow, right? We've got the one green section of town. The note was, yeah, but be careful because there are Jews living all around this area and they might show up. They might buy in. And then the class of the workers there labeled a lot of these communities yellow instead of blue, and green right here on the edge of the country club. But we got to be careful because Jews are starting to move in, and there will go the neighborhood was the thinking in 1940. So my dear friend, Phil Dolce from Bergen Community College, he's a sociology professor, and he often asks his students, when did their people become white, right? Because if you were Italian or Irish or Polish or even Jewish in New York City, right, you were not white, you were Italian or you were Irish. But when you moved to the suburbs, you could be white, or you could begin to be white. And yet in 1940, the HOLC evaluators were noticing, right, what your last name was, what your work was. I saw one note in this map in Hasbrook Heights. The foreign born thing, they didn't have a number. It was a question mark, but they said, but we think there are a lot of second generation Germans, right? So second generation Germans are first generation Americans, but they still labeled the neighborhood yellow because they couldn't figure out who these people were, right? And this is signage from this period of time, right? And this was real. This was real. in a lot of our communities, and it was baked into home ownership and neighborhoods. So what does it all mean today? And I want to give an acknowledgement to Will Payne. He's a Rutgers sort of social geography specialist, and his maps and things are totally awesome. So if we look at, so here's our redlining map, and here's what Will Payne did based on 2010 census data on where we live now by race and ethnicity, right? So we've got our large Asian populations hanging out over here in these immigrant areas there. We've got our Hispanic populations dotting the center part of our county, kind of where our yellow neighborhoods were then. Black folks were a little bit, well, there are not too many of us left in Bergen County, but these green folks, and we're still in the neighborhoods, quite honestly, where we were. When we look at household income distribution, you can see that that today our poorest communities still hover around where our red line communities are. This group up here would be the Ramapo Lenape tribal nation up in Mawa. Adult poverty in 2019. And again, you can kind of see that the maps are not exactly aligned, but these dark blue areas closely align with many of our red areas. All right, Englewood, Hackensack, Garfield, Lodi. Rental housing. Where are people renters instead of owners, right? And again, you can see the southern part of our community still popping. The county did a parks and open space master plan a number of years ago, and the places where there aren't parks and open space align very closely to our redlined areas, right? So no access to open space. One interesting thing, there was a study that came out in 2020, I think, that said redline neighborhoods across the country were hotter than non-redline neighborhoods. They don't have as many trees, they have more concrete, they don't have as many parks. And so as we face climate change, right, redline neighborhoods are just fundamentally hotter because they don't have as much greenery.
There's a question, how
Yeah.
redlining coincided with environmental problems like flood zones?
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, flood zones. Flood zones. Industry close by, right? So air pollution, and when everybody's sort of like, how could the highway system be racist, right? As Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg is saying, well, guess what? They were, right? They would go through redline neighborhoods, black neighborhoods, and so then therefore you had more truck traffic, and so then therefore more pollution in those neighborhoods. And so I was really trying to figure out, like, that the off ramp to I-95 in Englewood, right? And you're sort of, and I just have always wondered, like, why is it there, right? And so I tried to figure out, why is it there? Well, guess what? This section of Leonia was colored yellow. Yes, there was a blue neighborhood right here, but we had 2 red neighborhoods in Englewood. And guess where I-95 did its weird little spinny do thing, right? This is what Pete Buttigieg is talking about. And there, and obviously in lots of other parts of the country, it's so much more egregious, right? The highway comes right down through the main avenue of a thriving Black community. We didn't have, northern New Jersey was so built up, right? But like, wow, like, isn't that like a kind of a weird, right? Like, why does it curve? Why does it turn? Well, when they were gonna take people's property and stuff, right, and slice through a neighborhood, well, They're not going to slice through a green neighborhood, right? And they kind of skirted the edge of a blue neighborhood, but right through a yellow and a red neighborhood. That's where I-95 comes off in Englewood. So again, what does this mean? Home ownership, right? The property of your home is in the United States of America, if you own your home, it's the single largest asset that most people have, right? And so the average Black college graduate has less wealth than the average white high school dropout. The average Black college graduate has less wealth, not necessarily less income, but less wealth than the average white high school dropout. Because even if that college graduate owns his or her home, the likelihood that they own a home in a place where it is not going to appreciate in the same way because of who lives there and who will buy into that neighborhood. And in the United States, on average, it takes 5 generations for a family to move from poverty to median income. But that may mean that some families move in 1 or 2 generations, and some families move in 7 to 9 generations. And much of that is based on the value of one's home. And then finally, in health. What I've been saying as I've been doing a lot of this COVID equity work is COVID, the virus, does not discriminate, right? When you look at COVID cases in any community, it pretty much mirrors the demographics of that community. But when you look at deaths, you see inequality, right? So in Englewood, Asians were 3.3% of the cases in Englewood, but they were 8.2% of the deaths, right? African Americans, 13% of the cases, but 27% of the deaths. And so what does this mean? It means that they live in more crowded conditions. They have harder work or work that didn't allow them to stay at home. They're in poorer health, perhaps because of their environmental conditions, perhaps because of the work that they do, and all of those kinds of things. And if we could map, which someday somebody will map all the COVID cases and the COVID deaths, we're going to see huge pockets of it in our red line neighborhoods. Teaneck was similar, right? The cases look like the community. The deaths, and the Asian community was overwhelming. Bergenfield is very similar. All right, so here we go. And now that I've completely bummed you out, you're all going to say like, man, this was really depressing. So what do we do now? And I want to say that again, I believe that understanding and knowing how things got to how they are, I think is empowering, right? Because we have this trope, right, that we tell ourselves that our communities look like the way our communities look because people choose to live near and among people who are like them. And yeah, it's true, right? Like we want a good bagel shop. We want, we want authentic Chinese cuisine. We want to see people who look like us. There is some of that, right? But also we've been steered in places, and we really have to recognize that sometimes we've been steered in places and that our communities look the way they look because they were created that way by design, and then they were maintained that way by policy. So I would encourage you, if you're really interested in these issues and you really care about this kind of stuff, is to notice and learn and advocate. It's really important to notice how issues and arguments are framed in the public discourse. Is the frame about winners and losers, us versus them, newcomers versus the established, right? And every time that frame happens, then we create this zero-sum game, right? We can't possibly teach the complicated history of the United States of America because it might make white kids feel bad, right? And yet, if we don't teach the complicated history of America, then Black, brown, yellow, and Jewish children won't see themselves in it, right? And so, like, what is that? So who gets to decide who gets to feel good in school and to feel like the history of their country is complicated and not always pretty? And then dig deeper into the issues and see how they got to where it is today, right? So here in Bergen County, I will tell you that we have a terrible housing option problem. We have a terrible housing option problem. And every time any community begins to grapple with, I'm going to say the words affordable housing, but I don't like to say the words affordable housing because I think it's been stigmatized, right? But anytime any town begins to grapple with, can everybody who wants to live in our community afford to live in our community? It makes people flip out. It'll destroy property values. It'll destroy the schools. It will do all these things, right? And it becomes an us versus them, a winners and losers thing. And as soon as that happens, we can't have a truly rational discussion about whether or not my child in her first job out of college can afford to live in the community where she grew up in. She can't. So she's in Buffalo, right? Your favorite barista, you name it, they can't afford to live here. Your pre-kindergarten teacher in your public school district probably can't afford to live in your community unless we begin to decide that we can have housing options for a lot of people at all different price points and career points. And that is a huge issue in Bergen County. It started with boroughitis. It was solidified in redlining, and it is continuing to this day with the NIMBY thing that we have, right? In Ridgewood, it was called high density housing. It was an apartment building. High density housing? Like, what is that? They weren't going to build Cabrini Green in Ridgefield, but as soon as it was multifamily housing or an apartment complex, they framed it as high density, and that sent everybody skittering. We don't want that here, and we don't want them here, right? Why can't we have great schools for all kids?
Just a couple of comments, actually. So
yes, please.
So Jackie says we always knew Ridgewood was restricted, and then she and then she actually added the slide where you talked about that little area in Teaneck. She said they lived there in 1972 to 2001. That was interesting because just think that they were able to get a mortgage,
to sneak a little house. Like get in there with that. Yeah, I mean, some of you may, if you flip through your deeds, you may find a racial covenant in your deeds now, right? And I just was reading about an article about a woman who was trying to figure out how to get it out of her deed. It's no longer enforceable, but it's there in the paperwork. But it's very, very difficult to even get it erased, right? And I don't know if it should be erased. But anyway, go ahead, Nina.
Lil,
and I'll turn this off in a second.
Yeah, Lil says, not educating the truth hurts white folks too. Many just don't realize it.
Yes. And I want to really emphasize that again, because I when I talk about the 5 generations between, poverty and median income, it's extremely important to understand, right, that like we talk about redlining, but if we focus on the yellow lined neighborhoods, right, those folks were mostly white, but they were of Italian or Polish or German or Jewish descent. Their property values didn't increase the way they were supposed to either. And so there are a lot of white folks who have been held back by the systemic racism and classism and anti-immigrantism that was baked into the homeowners loan corporation. So we tend to talk about this as a race, a black and white thing. It's starkly different in the wealth accumulation when you look at black people compared to other people or white people. But I bet you if we could parse out the wealth accumulation of third or fourth generation Italian Americans compared to third or fourth generation, I don't know, Scottish or English, right? You're going to see that these maps held lots more families back than just Black families. So it's not just a Black people problem. It's an all people problem. So thank you, Lil, for mentioning that. Go ahead, Nina. I'm sorry. How am I doing on time?
Oh, we're good. We're good. Adrian says, what about Mount Laurel?
Right. Okay. So the Mount Laurel court decision. Whew. All right. So New Jersey has done a lot of really interesting things, right? It's actually a quite fascinating state where a lot of experimentation and other kinds of things can happen for a whole variety of reasons based on our structure. So the Mount Laurel decision was around creating affordable, that all communities had to build affordable housing. It's in like the late 70s, 1980s, something like that. It created COA, right? The Council on Affordable Housing. And there was COA 1 and COA 2. And I don't know, we're probably up to COA number 45. And then in the Christie administration, we suspended COA and we didn't even put any people on the COA board to decide. And basically what Mount Laurel said is any community can't build new development without balancing it with some affordable housing. So in the early years of COA, well-to-do communities could just pay poorer communities to build affordable housing, right? So that just exacerbated for about 10 or 15 years the discrepancy about where affordable housing was, right? So a town like, I don't know, Ramsey might pay Patterson to build more affordable housing so they didn't have to build any in Ramsey. I shouldn't pick on them, but you know what I mean.
Why not pick on them? That's the way it happened.
That's the way it happens, right? Sorry if there's anybody from Ramsey on. And so then everybody agreed that was just kind of disgusting, right? So they stopped doing that. So then it was like, no, you have to make some affordable housing happen where you are. And that's when the lawsuit started. And that's when the foot dragging and the blah, blah, blah. Fair Share Housing is the organization in New Jersey that sues every single municipality all the time. They are a single issue group and they do a lot of good things and they force towns to come up with a fair share housing plan. I'll tell you for Englewood, one of the real kickers about Englewood, because we're just Englewood, right? And so even before Mount Laurel, Englewood built affordable housing, right? We built King Gardens, we built Westmore Gardens, we built 111 West, we built Rock Creek, right? Not because we had to, but because the people were here. Those were, as I understand it, those were pretty rundown neighborhoods and other kinds of things. But we did it, not because the law said we had to, not under duress. Well, Mount Laurel starts the clock after Englewood had already done that. So Englewood doesn't get a whole lot of credit for having been a pretty progressive community that built public housing, right, and affordable housing before we were required to. So when I was on the council and all the new development had come online, the brownstones and what's the one across the highway, the other one, and the downtown thing, all of a sudden we potentially had a COA problem, right? Because we didn't make those developers include a lot of affordable housing in the mix. And Fair Share Housing sued us. They did. And they came into court and said terrible things about us, about Englewood. But the thing was that they didn't actually know Englewood. They hadn't bothered to do their homework. They didn't understand how much affordable housing and public housing was already in our community. And so we got a pretty favorable ruling from the judge, because Englewood actually did a lot before we even had to. It doesn't mean we don't need to do more. But I will say that Mount Laurel has proven to be a pretty toothless, in my opinion, a pretty toothless instrument. And I'll say this, very often, look, I'm a great admirer of the courts, and I think the judicial system, mostly it's fun on rough times, but it's really easy to sit on the bench and make a decision about how things should work, or how things should be. But in my experience, there's not a lot of practicality in how to get there in it, right? So we can think of the Brown versus Board of Education, right? One of the most famous Supreme Court decisions ever, and with all deliberate speed. And yet we sit here today, and American public schools are more segregated today than they were in 1963. And in New Jersey, right? New Jersey is the 6th most segregated state for Black school children and the 7th most segregated state for Hispanic school children. So all deliberate speed didn't mean anything. And our communities our schools are that segregated because our property ownership is that segregated. As long as you go to school near where you live, guess what? If your town is segregated, right? If you're redline communities and your communities that are completely unaffordable to anybody starting out, your schools are going to be segregated. So with all deliberate speed is really nice, like Supreme Court language, but there wasn't anything practical in helping anybody figure out how to get there. And so Mount Laurel says you should build affordable housing and you should make affordable housing happen. But there's no help, there's not real practical help for communities to get there. And mostly there just have been a lot of loopholes to allow people to scooch around it.
So a follow-up question on that is affordable housing about ownership?
No. Well, it could be, but no, it could, it's also often about rental, right? Although I think ownership is better, right? So there's some communities around the country that are kind of experimenting with this idea of like a starter home, right? And so you're able to buy in and you build some equity, and then when you sell, you can buy another house, but the house itself stays a starter home. So you get some equity as you move on to a bigger house or something, but somebody else can come into it now at like similar circumstances that you did, right? Should we have a rent-to-own system in the United States of America, right? Like that you kind of build equity in your apartment or your condo or your house. I don't know, I think, and I think some of it, we're changing our thoughts about home ownership, right? Because too many people have gone underwater between 2008, 2009, and now the pandemic. And it's scary. I will tell you that, Joe and I, like, we barely came out, breathing from the house that we owned in Cleveland. And Cleveland was kind of a canary in the coal mine of the housing implosion that happened in 2008, 2009. So there's a lot that's scary about home ownership. So I think we have to ask ourselves, is home ownership the only way to start to accumulate assets and wealth in the United States? It has been for a couple of generations, not equally among different groups, but I don't actually know the answer to that. It's going to take a smart, an economist or somebody to answer that, but that's a really good question. Yeah.
Quick comment, and then another question, which is a kind of a new topic, actually. So Scott just commented, in Englewood, it wasn't a neighborhood, it was literally the railroad tracks.
Yeah. Yes. It was literally the railroad tracks.
And
Yeah.
then this question, and I'm not sure if you have more on your PowerPoint, but I'll just ask.
No,
you
I'm almost,
and
this is it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the question is, can you speak to the current gentrification taking place?
Yeah. So, God, right. It's so, it's so complicated and it's so insidious, right? If we're not careful. So on the one hand, of course we want some investment and some newness in neighborhoods that have been neglected, right, for generations. But as soon as we do, if we're not careful and we don't invest in the people who were there the whole time, right, we tip the balance, we gentrify it, and we force the people out who anchored the community and the neighborhood. I will tell you, I'm looking at this a lot. I don't have answers right now. There are some interesting programs in the state of New Jersey. There, this neighborhood preservation program, and a couple of other things that are really trying to invest in the people and the businesses that have anchored a community while new things start to happen. But it's a very tricky balance. And I don't believe we have it right. There are few communities around the country that have been trying to do some really, amazing and hard things to not have it just gentrify. But I don't believe we figured it out. I don't believe we figured it out. And it's interesting because I was listening to a radio piece about a community in New Orleans where the highway came through and destroyed this historically Black community. And now the question is, well, should we rip out the highway or should we do something else with it? And the people in the community are really debating that because it's like, but there's a whole like cool marketplace that like pops up underneath the highway. So if you take the overpass out, maybe we could make the overpass kind of like the High Line and make it green space in this community, right? Like all these things that are not, and so there are no simple fixes to what is broken. And we have to, and gentrification is a huge weight on this. And I don't know whether like the answer is that the longtime homeowners or property owners in a neighborhood that like their tax valuation goes up much more slowly than anything new, right? Because sometimes that's what happens is like a new development comes in and now all the property in the neighborhood is more valuable. And so then suddenly I've lived in my home for 45 years and now the taxes skyrocket because my house is suddenly so much more valuable because of the people who built across the street. But but nothing about my circumstances has changed that much unless I sell my home, in which case I can get the value of that. But I don't want to sell my home. I want to live there. Right. So do we need to have policies that kind of recognize like who anchored the neighborhood for a long time so that they don't get slammed, right, by the neighbor's property? They sold it and it went up. And so now the value of my property goes up. Again, this is way smarter people than me need to wrestle with this. But the key is, and that's a great question, the key is we have to have the right voices, right, at the table. We can't just say, well, we determine property tax values based on how the other houses similar sold, because what if the other houses similar sold to a developer who paid top dollar? Right. And we need to have some people saying, well, wait a minute, though, but Mrs. McGillicuddy, she's just been here for 50 years and she doesn't want to sell to the developer. So why should she be punished? Because she wants to stay in her house. And if we're not at the table asking those questions, that's how gentrification, just like wildfire, just takes over through a neighborhood, because Mrs. McGillicuddy's taxes will go up so much she can't afford to stay there, and so then she has to sell, and then poof, there goes the neighborhood.
Do you want to finish this and unshare, and then I'll
yeah, I just wanted to point out these couple of books. Heather McGee's book, The Sum of Us, is incredibly awesome. It's a very easy read, and she starts from this premise about why can't we have nice things, and kind of looks at how racism does it. The Color of Law is really built around the redlining whole thing, and the impact of redlining in lots of different communities. And then The Whiteness of Wealth is actually about the tax code. And I have to tell you, like, reading a book about the tax code, but or look up a podcast where she's talking about it. It's completely fascinating, and it will show you how as like a working family, right? When you wonder, like, how is it that Jeff Bezos doesn't pay any taxes, but I do? She's got answers for you. And it's quite fascinating. And then, yeah, and I think the biggest question is, how is your community shaped? And does that shaping reflect your values? And if it doesn't, what are you going to do about it, right? And what are you going to say about it? And so that's what I wanted to say. So.
Okay, so I have a couple more questions, and actually that last book kind of perfectly segues into it. This question is, how did this affect investing among people of color or minorities?
Oh my God, right?
I think that might be a high school student actually that asked.
Oh, cool, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So how to invest? One of the things that this Dorothy Brown, and she's a professor in the law school at Emory, and she specializes in taxes. Like, what? Like it's just a Black woman. Anyway, one of the things that Black communities did back in the day was they would form investment clubs, right? And so, like, every second Thursday they'd all get together and they'd read the stocks and talk about things, and they'd pool their money and they'd buy shares of stock. We've lost a lot of that communal kind of investing strategy. There used to be rent parties where you'd throw a little party, you'd have a few snacks and a bottle of booze, rot gut booze, and people would come over and leave $5 to help you pay your rent if you fell on hard times. And so, but having the money to invest, or pooling one's money or a community's money to invest, was the way Black communities used to do it. Actually, truthfully, before the civil rights movement, when they were locked into their communities. Once integration started to happen and people could move and go, we lost a lot of that communal spirit of investing together, buying property together, right? And trying to advance multiple households at the same time.
Okay, this question, so there are a couple that are, I think, similar. I know we talked a little about the effect of redlining on school systems. Does redlining affect the quality of education in those declining and hazardous neighborhoods that the children are receiving?
Yes, right? So our schools are funded by taxes on property. And if the property doesn't have value, or the value of the property doesn't appreciate, then the schools don't get more money. Now, that is not our problem in Englewood, and it's important for us to understand this, right? Because even though our public schools are highly segregated, the overall property valuation of Englewood is quite high, right? Because we have the East Hill, and we have the, and we have the West Hill, like we have the downtown district. The property values of Englewood overall are very strong. But if you think about a community like Patterson or Jersey City, right? And quite honestly, almost all of Patterson would have been redlined. I haven't looked at the map, but I can pretty much guarantee that is so. And so the property values stagnated or fell, which would then mean that there wasn't very much money for the school. You know what I mean? You're not collecting a lot of money for the schools, so then the schools suffer, and you create this, what's the opposite of a virtuous circle? You create a downward spiral, right? We don't have enough money to do what we need to do. We have more and more kids and families in distress, and we don't have enough money to do what we should do for kids and families that are in distress. And it just becomes this sick cycle. Yes, Englewood schools have other issues that are not related to funding, right? It's not the money. I mean, the truth of the matter is Englewood public schools are quite well funded, and yet we can't do that. So I don't want to suggest that money is the end all be all. But when you look at particularly city school systems in some communities, Newark, Camden, Patterson, places where what redlining did to property values in those communities then starved the schools.
So a Q&A question is, are banks likely to lend money to people living in redlined communities?
They have to now. Right? So there is this thing called Community Reinvestment Act, and every bank gets judged by their regulators on the work that they do by reinvesting in communities that banks typically ignored because of redlining. However, how banks satisfy their Community Reinvestment Act obligations are very complicated. You still don't see a whole lot of mortgages going into first-time home buyers, buyers of color buying a house in a neighbor. It's just because sometimes they can, in Bergen County, they buy a table at a gala and they call it their Community Reinvestment Act. And that's just not the same thing as giving a mortgage to a family who's going to then build equity. So some of the things that we're trying to do is to get the banks to invest money in, they're called community development financial institutions, credit unions, and others who are willing to give a mortgage to a first-time home buyer buying a home in a neighborhood that a well-known bank wouldn't touch, right? We'll go there and lend them the money, but you should backstop our mortgage for that person. So there's some ways around it, but and I apologize to the bankers on here. Banks talk a good game, but it's been with all deliberate speed kind of thing. We haven't really seen it change as rapidly as it should have.
This is an interesting question. If redlining has gotten better for white immigrants over the years, the immigrants who are white.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Right. Nobody's ever going to walk into a neighborhood and go, wow, there are too many immigrants in here. Like, I'm not buying a house over here. Where it is still a challenge is where people own property, but they rent their property to others, right? Absentee landlords are not good for neighborhoods because they're not there and they don't care often about the conditions. And so sometimes a neighborhood can struggle with a large immigrant population, not just because the immigrants are there, but because the property owner isn't providing quality housing and upkeep on their property because they don't live there, right? But yes, and so the civil rights legislation, the Fair Housing Act of 1960, blah, 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 redlining is done. If any of you have bought a house in the last, I don't know, however many years, you had to sign all sorts of documents, right? Attesting to that the real estate agent showed you properties in all sorts of neighborhoods and didn't steer you to certain places or other places. I once in college with a college buddy of mine, we pretended to be a couple and tried to see if we could rent apartments, and we went all around Atlanta, as a test couple, right, to see if we were treated differently than our white friends who came along right behind us and also tried to rent an apartment. Like, there's all kinds of like interesting things that happen,
What
but
happened?
Mostly,
What was the result?
We never had a situation where we were steered one way or the other, which was kind of a bummer because it would have been kind of interesting and sort of fun just to see what would happen. But yeah, there's a lot of testing. There's a lot of regulation and paperwork on the real estate industry now. So you probably didn't really think about all the papers that you signed, but a lot when you buy a house, but a lot of those papers are you saying that I was not directed to only certain neighborhoods. Like I got to see anything I wanted to see, and the real estate agent wasn't steering me this way or that way. Real estate, part of the whole the history of block busting is this neighborhood busting, right? Yes, right. Cory Booker talks about that, and a lot of people, there were some stories a couple years ago, right, where a black woman was having somebody come appraise her house because she wanted to sell it, and the appraisals kept being really low, right? So she stripped all the African American stuff out of her house and had her white friend stand there, and suddenly the value of her house went up, I don't know, like 45%. So I'm not suggesting to you that there's no racism still baked into the system. There is a lot. If you're not careful. And so, yeah, if you're a black homeowner and you want to sell your house, the truth of the matter is you probably ought to take all your family photographs out of it, and stage it so that nobody knows who lives there. That's a really horrible thing to say, but it's happening in some communities.
Okay, I think we're out of time. So I mean, was I right? I know I can't see everyone, but I'm so right that was really, really informative and fascinating. So thank you so much. CRUE would really like to open up the opportunity for more conversation. That's kind of what our goal has been. So a couple of things that we'd like to offer. You can either go on our Facebook group and talk about that. You could put in the chat if you're interested in kind of identifying topics in which you would like to continue the dialogue, and we'll reach back out to you. You could also email. It's CRUENJ, CRUENJ@gmail.com. You could talk, anything that kind of interests you that surrounds this, affordable housing, education, redlining. You can put your name and your topic that you're interested in discussing. We'll reach back out to you. We'll have more conversations like this. So, just to wrap up, thank you so much, Lynn. It really was incredible. And then also, on behalf of CRUE, thank you to the library. Thank you all so much for coming. We hope to see you at our next CRUE event. Again, the Facebook page is CRUENJ. The recording will be up for anyone who missed it, or if anyone wants to revisit anything, please feel free to do so. And thank you for coming. Have a
Thanks
great
for this
night.
opportunity. Happy holidays, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Stay safe. Thanks, Nina.
Thank you, Lynn. So great. I mean, I just love that presentation. So really terrific.
Thank you. Happy holidays.
Yeah.
And
I think I see in the chat, a lot of people are just saying, I don't know if you can see how excellent the presentation was. And it really was.
And we had a nice turnout too. Wow.
Yeah. I think 63 was our biggest number. So thank you so much. I learned so much. Cute. And just so you know, well, I don't know if she's on here or not, but Debbie Aronson said some of her high school students were going to be on, and I think I recognize some of the names.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. That's great.
Oh,
good.
yeah. Judy Aronson. That's what
Judy
I meant.
Aronson. Yeah. Oh,
yeah, thank you, everyone. Students.
That's fantastic. Good. Thank you both. Sorry for the technical difficulties at the beginning, but I think we pulled it off. Look at that. A few minutes early.
Have a good night.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.